Hello, welcome to Prepscale classes or classroom. I am Dr. Prasanth VG. Today we are going to look at the poetry of John Donne, who almost borders with Jacobean and the previous Elizabethan age. As my illustration says, his lifespan was from 1572 to 1631, and we are going to look at two poems towards the end of the presentation. So, at the outset, let me welcome all of you to this wonderful program, which is beneficial to both of us, and I wish you best of luck before we make a beginning. So, let us get started. So, when you look at Donne's poetry or Donne as a whole, you can easily state that he is the finest of or the best among the metaphysical school of poets, which I will be explaining further down the line. And he was also a dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, London, where many of the poets are buried. It is a very popular place of attraction in southern London. And Donne is often considered as the greatest love poet of English language. Can be controversial or can be challenged, but I personally conclude that he is definitely one of the best poets that we have actually discovered. So, he was born of a Roman Catholic period, and you are going to take the exam which is objective in nature. So, my presentation is actually almost a tailor-made with the objective multiple choice kind of a question. So, you have to keep in mind that he was the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, which I said in the earlier slide, and you also keep in mind that he was a Roman Catholic, born as a Roman Catholic in a Protestant country like England, and his mother had a direct descendants of a family had a direct descendants seems to be from Thomas More in the 12th century. So, you understand that he has a great lineage or maybe a tradition. And the biography of John Donne, which is also an important landmark, done by Isaac Walton, and I have put the cover page for you in the slide. And his education in the University of Cambridge could not be completed because he had to take an oath in the name of Queen Elizabeth, who seems to be a Protestant queen. So, being a Catholic, he could not take that oath. So, his education had to come to a standstill. He couldn't complete that. And then comes to his personal life. He became secretary to Thomas Egerton, and as you understand the love story, he met Anne More, niece of Egerton, and of course they were secretly in love, and they knew certainly well that Sir George More, who was the father of this lady, would not consent his affair with this lady, and they secretly married, and that was exposed naturally, and he was disinherited by both his father-in-law as well as his employer, right. So, he was in a mess, and he had to suffer a lot because of this secret love he had, and he was disinherited, and he fell into almost a kind of a poverty-stricken life. Despite the misery, Donne wrote beautiful poems. Maybe we would say that the poetry is very often created during the worst times rather than the best times. And he began to work on theology, and many of you may not be aware that Donne is a expert in theology, and he was very good in canon laws, and he was writing in or almost defending anti-Catholic ideology. He comprises love poems. So, this conflict or maybe this contradiction between being a poet, a love poet, and also a religious practitioner or maybe a priest is very fundamental to Donne's poetry. And the complimentary and funerary verse that he has written for his patrons, and you understand that in those days England used to, when rich people used to hire poets to write about them. So, such patronage I think Donne enjoyed quite well. In 1614 King James I refused, ultimate rejection, that is a final Supreme Court. So, he was refused to have the final attempt to secure a post at court, and the king made it very clear that if at all Donne is going to be incorporated in any of the system, it is the ecclesiastical system, not anywhere else. So, he does not have much of a choice. So, he accepts the post of a clergy and he went for a training. Then November 1621 he was installed as a dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, which was my first point I made in the presentation. And 2 years after his ordination he became accepted the priesthood. Then he in 1617 and Donne died. So, the moment or maybe the year in which he was reinstated, he was having a good career. That time he had another tragedy, death of his wife, that seems to shatter him very much. And age of 33, she was just 33 in those at that point of time. And after giving birth to a stillborn child, and grief stricken Donne was actually, he was almost done with that. There was an emotional breakage and he left with the task of raising the children, and he also vowed not to marry again, of course, and bereavement turned to be fully his vocation, and Anglican divide and the power and of God maybe, or that of the clergy, he actually wanted to integrate with his life. So, he turned a kind of a person, a kind of a poet who celebrated the physical love, gradually turned to a person who has been celebrating the eternal or the kind of God, love for God. So, this particular dichotomy you can very much find in the holy sonnets, which I will be coming to in the next slides, and maybe repetition. Then he became a very favorite of both King James I and Charles I. So, he had towards the end of his life certain patronage being showered by the king. Most scholars of today agree that the elegies, and you have to remember that, because I just brought in this particular aspect, because elegy is not used in the modern sense of the term, in the sense a poem of lamentation. So, it is the idea that, which is Donne's case, the poems of love, elegies are poems of love, not of mourning and not of mourning. Epigrams, verse letters and satires, that is a major output of Donne, and songs and sonnets, very important work by Donne. You are likely to get a question on that. And 90s until 17, and the holy sonnets, which I will be presenting it bit more detail later. Holy sonnets, sonnets that celebrate love, but of course addressed to God, and other religious lyrics from the time of Donne's marriage until his death in 1615 during the Jacobin. So, he was born in Elizabethan age, but took up his career as a poet in the Jacobean age. He composed the hymns late in his life in the 20s. Towards the end, I think I already told you that he was closer to God. And another very important work is Anniversaries, Donne's poem Anniversaries, published in 1611, 12, and were the only important poetic work by him published during his lifetime. And many of his works were actually published posthumously after his death. It is marked by strikingly original. So, this is why we adore, why we worship Donne, is simply because he is a kind of a writer in those days who was most original, in the sense that during those days you had a tradition of poetry, or maybe an onset, which is already a set pattern, just like we have movies, right? You have a set pattern of movies. Now, if somebody makes a movie entirely different from the what is existing, so he or she can be called a iconoclast, most original kind of a person, or a maybe filmmaker. Similarly, he is strikingly original, and there is a departure from the conventions of 16th century. So, 16th century poetry in England or in Latin or in contemporary Europe never had this kind of originality as you have in John Donne. and especially the poetry of those days, or the poets, established poets of those days, were Philip Sidney and Spenser, and Donne was so unlike Sidney or Spenser. So, that is why we said, I said that he was surprisingly original. And even in its early satires and elegies again you remember that it is not a poem of lamentation, but rather a love poem, which derive from classical Latin models. Though the model adopted was classical Latin, he never had a thematic resemblance with any of the classical Latin poems. And definitely there is experiment or experimentation with genre, form and imagery. All three entities you had this kind of reformation, or maybe a kind of a newness, novelty. His poems contain few descriptive passages like Spenser, there is no description at all, it is condensed, and also lines follow the smooth metrics and a kind of euphonious, meaning soothing to the ear, that of his Spenser or Sidney. So, he never used poetry as it was used by, or as the trend was set by Sidney or Spenser. From this explosive beginnings, for example, you have a poem like, for God's sake hold your tongue and let me love. Why does busy unruly sun, why does through curtains and windows call on us? Such kind of abrupt classical kind of a beginning, classical in the sense Donne's level of classics, explosive beginnings, the poems developed into a closely reasoned argument. So, this is the pattern of Donne's poetry. You have a statement, then it is argumented one by one, and it has a very logical kind of a structure, and it almost equals like a mathematical formula, right, where LHS is finally proved to be RHS. So, that kind of logical coherence is what you find in Donne. And what is the most important aspect is the conceit, use of conceit. Conceit is nothing but an extended metaphor, a metaphor which is extended further. Actually, the metaphor, what you understand by metaphor is that a metaphor has a tenor and a vehicle. Tenor is a subject and vehicle is a image that carries the idea, right. So, Achilles rushed on like a lion, that is a simile. Achilles the lion rushed down, Achilles the lion is the metaphor. So, Achilles is the tenor and lion is the vehicle. So, lion is used to communicate the idea or the nature of the person Achilles. So, in a metaphor there are two entities, one is a tenor and another is a vehicle. In Donne's situation, this tenor vehicle relationship is extended further, which I will be coming to when I do the poem canonization or maybe valediction. Both poems have this kind of conceit, and there is an ingenious parallel drawn between two things, which is so original, like lovers are like compass, which nobody actually had in mind, or it is so original, right. That is why even Dryden came up with a very negative kind of a comment, which I will be coming to in the later slides. And dissimilar situations, objects, what cannot be actually put together are put together, what cannot be usually thought to be together are put together. This is what you call by conceit. And vehicle for transmitting multiple and sometimes contradictory ideas, multiple definitely, when that is why you use a metaphor. If you use a simile, there is only one-to-one correspondence, but if you use a metaphor, there are multiple ways in which you can relate to that, but it is very often contradictory even. So, these are some of the features of Donne's poetry. He drew his imagery from diverse fields available in those days, like alchemy, that is our chemistry, modern chemistry, astronomy, again still we have astronomy, astrophysics, medicine, never thought of in those days, you can never think of drawing an image from medicine, politics, global exploration and philosophy. And Samuel Johnson, exactly, only Johnson can say such things, this is a very important quote, heterogeneous, so dissimilar, apparently contradictory, ideas yoked by violence together, they are just put into together yoked, clubbed into by violence, by force. So, what Donne has done in his poetry is what is apparently dissimilar, they are just put under pressure. That is the comment made by Dr. Johnson. This is a very popular comment, and you are likely to get a question on this. In Donne's sermons, what is most powerful is illustrate the mastery of prose. So, though we know Donne as a poet, his prose also stands some, it is worthy of comments. 156 of them were published by his son in a folio edition, 1640, 49, 61. So, his son had done a great contribution by publishing or identifying his father's works and making it available for the public. And you must also understand what is a folio edition. You need to understand what is a folio edition. Just for your information, folio edition and quarto editions were two editions that were very popular in those days. Quarto meaning you divide a page into four, that is quarto, four sides, I mean 4 areas. So, you have a page divided into 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that is called a quarto edition. In a folio edition, it is divided into 3 vertical lines, not like plus, right, not like this where you have 4 pages, but like this 3 pages. So, within a page you have 3 rows, that is called a folio edition. So, the folio edition and quarto edition is nothing to do with the text, but it is only with respect to the way in which it is printed. Though composed during the time of religious controversy, Donne's sermons, it is very intellectual, witty and deeply moving, explore the basic principles of Christianity, and rather than engage them in theological dispute. So, Donne always kept away from such disputes, though in poetry was so rational, logical and experimentative. In theology and also in as a priest, he was actually away from such controversies. Donne brilliantly analyzed biblical text, and he was a very popular preacher in those days, and applied them to contemporary events such as the outbreak of plague that devastated in 1625 London. So, he has a charm in explaining or providing sermons in the church. Especially what is commendable is the commentary he made on the punishment of God with respect to the 1625 Black Death called plague. The power of his sermons derives from the dramatic intensity. He used to make the show very colorful, and candid personal revelations. He used to make his sermons quite personal by maybe narrating anecdotes, stories, rhythms and striking conceits. So, being a poet, he could actually impress his audience quite well. However, you do not be under the impression that he was very popular in those days. No, he was not at all popular. The general taste was against. Nobody appreciated his poetry or his writing in those days, and especially because poetry was a bit esoteric, not something easily understandable. So, the wit meaning intelligent comment. So, that wit was never appreciated, because you remember that in those days you never had a large number of people reading poetry. You have only very limited number of people who can write and read. The notable exception, but I do not say that it was totally unpopular. There were some writers, and this is important for your examination. I would like to quote one name, such name is Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope appreciated his intellectual virtuosity, and of course, he was great admirer of Donne. Then comes Robert Browning in the 18th century, Victorian writers. Browning appreciated Donne with providing his germ for dramatic monologue. He intended, or he rather expressed his thankfulness to Donne for providing, or which maybe I think Donne has made him identify, Browning identify his masterpiece dramatic monologue. And 20th century, everything turned upside down, because when you have the Grierson coming up with his work, where T.S. Eliot contributed a great deal in reviving Donne's poetry. and especially you remember that the metaphysical poets, which I will be referring to in the next slide, that particular individual masterpiece by T.S. Eliot has completely refurbished Donne's importance in the tradition of English poetry. There is a remarkable, as I said, there is a remarkable revival done by Eliot. Now, so how do you look at the play of intellect in the poetry of T.S. Eliot? I am sorry, Donne. So, the scorn of conventionally poetic images. So, none of the cliched images referring to love, referring to anything is taken as such by Donne, and he has used this realism and a style that he invented himself, and none of the English speaking poets or none of the English speaking audience could understand the merit of Donne's poetry during his lifetime. We had to wait for another 400 plus years to understand the actual merit of Donne's poetry. So, readers continue to find stimulation from Donne's fusion of witty argument, and of course, what has been described as by Dr. Johnson as yoking together of by violence and rendering complex states of mind and daring and unhackneyed images, unrepetitive, and ability to make common words produce extraordinary effects without distorting the essential quality of English idiom, English language, English words. So, let us look at what exactly is this how this label is actually stuck.